so let's start, go through our study guide part 2. So we're going to pick up with development. So in the previous video, we did political geography and urban geography. Now we're going to look at development and economic geography. All right, first is underdeveloped, developed countries, no definite definitions and some spatial patterns, know why development varies by country. So why development varies by country is going to be those different indicators. So socio-demographic, which means people. So things like the infant mortality rate. Sustainability is going to be another one. So the environment, how they treat the environment. And then economics. So things like gross domestic product, purchasing power parity, gross national income, those things. So, and underdeveloped or lesser developed LDCs, and then more developed MDCs are what we're calling it. Or sometimes global south is a generalized term for nations that are considered less developed, and then global north for countries that are considered more developed. So right there you have some spatial patterns, but really what you see is the highest developed countries are going to be in North America, Western Europe, and parts of East Asia. So think Japan, South Korea, not China. Don't put China in the mix yet. And then the lesser developed countries are generally in South Asia. So think India, think Pakistan, Myanmar, Laos, Vietnam, and then a lot in sub-Saharan Africa as well. And then other ones like Haiti or Afghanistan that have a history of conflict, of issues. Okay. And then there's also these in-between countries. Hang on. Come here. Oh, there's a lot into this one. Okay. So BRICS, it's an acronym, so everything stands for, each letter of BRICS stands for a country. And that's, you're not the highest developed or the lowest developed. You're not the best football team, the Chiefs winning winning the Super Bowl, but you're also not the worst. So you're not ranked 16th. You're not ranked first. You're kind of in the middle. You've got some strengths and some weaknesses. BRICS are Brazil, Russia, India. Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And then if you add the S, South Africa. Another acronym for these newly emerging economies or economies that are kind of in between, they're not ranked really high in development, but they're not ranked really low, is the MINTS. And that's Mexico, Indonesia, Indonesia. I can't even think of the other countries. Let me look it up. God, my brain is fried. Anyway, all right. And then know also the definition of development. Where are you, PowerPoint? I don't know how to do anything on one of these. So know the definition of development, the process of improving the material conditions and the livelihoods of various countries throughout the world. All right. I'm so bad at this computer. Just take a break if you're listening to me. Sorry, something closed. And I'm working on my husband's computer. I'm not really sure how to work it. Oh, there we go. There, we're back. Okay. So, next, Human Development Index. It was created by the United Nations. It ranks all the 192-ish countries in the world on a ranking from 1, which is the best. That's currently Norway, to 192. That kind of varies. It's usually a sub-Saharan African country. Oh yeah, MINTS. Sorry, Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. Okay, so Human Development Index, and what's the point? What's the point of ranking all these countries in terms of their development? Well, the idea is to learn from one another and see, what is Norway doing well? Can we apply that to a country like the Congo and try to improve their standard of living as well? Economic indicators of development. You guys went over this we talked about this quite a bit. It was on your quiz. Where did all the PowerPoints go? Anyway, so economic indicators of development are things like gross national income, gross domestic product, purchasing power parity. These things that really measure the economic output of a country. But it doesn't, you're taking the pulse of the economy, but not necessarily the people. So that's why we add in socio-demographic indicators. So you might have a country that's doing super well on paper in terms of its economy, like say China or India, but the average person is not seeing those benefits. So we look at socio-demographic indicators such as education levels, life expectancy, infant mortality, things like that. So know those, they're straight out of the textbook. Environmental indicators, sustainability. That's why we talk about sustainable development. So the idea that you develop without crushing the environment so that other generations can also have a good life, be developed, and still have the resources like clean air, solar power, things like that. Gender inequality index. So the gender inequality index is saying, okay, development tells us this much of the story, but what about the women? What's going on with the women? So because a country may, again, look good on paper, but if women are not experiencing freedoms such as work, being able to work outside the home, running for office, education, things like how adolescent fertility rate. So if people are having a baby at a young age, that's not great, but it might be an indicator that women aren't treated as equally as men in that country. All right, where are we? Income inequality, that's where the inequality adjusted HDI comes in. So it's a way, again, so they say development, the Human Development Index only tells us this much of the story. We need to learn what's happening in these countries, like let's say Saudi Arabia, where they have a lot of money, they have a strong economy, but only so many people, because of income inequality, only a few of those few people in that society get the benefits, while most people are, do not have a high life expectancy or access to a good education. Don't worry about gross national income. So cut that off. Gross national income, we've talked about that enough. We don't need to have that on the final. Geographic and regional patterns in development, we kind of talked about, we just talked about this. So North America, Western Europe, so think Germany, France, the United Kingdom, East Asia, Japan, South Korea, and then going south to Australia, New Zealand. These are the very, very wealthy countries. That's definitely a pattern. And then there's, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia are going to have lower developed countries. And then countries in the middle are going to be countries in East Asia, countries in Latin America, etc. Purchasing power parity is just a definition from the textbook, but don't worry about it for the test. Inequality adjusted HDI, it's a measure of income inequality in a country. And why development is a normative project. So we think of development as being a really good thing, like you're developing, people are going to have better educations, things like that. But there's been a critique about how development is basically making countries all across the diversity of the world replicate the United States model of fast, market-oriented development. And then you have countries like in the video in lecture of Bhutan, the mountainous Himalayan country, that say, no, what we value is not necessarily how much money we make. It's things like how much time we spend with our families. Have we maintained the integrity of our natural environment? So by normative, they're saying you're trying to make the diversity of countries into one size fits all, and the norm is the United States, and not every country needs to be like the United States to be considered developed. There's other ways of looking at how well your country is doing. Okay, our last section, economic geography. Definition of economic geography. study things like economics. Next, BRIC nations. We just went over it. Let's go over it again. So these middle economies that are not more developed countries, MDCs, or less developed countries, LDCs, they're not, Afghanistan or Norway. They're somewhere in between. Each letter stands for a country: Brazil, Russia, India, China. 5 characteristics of post-industrial societies. Don't worry about it. Newly industrialized economies with examples. So newly industrialized economies, I did not put quotes on it on the study guide, but put quotes. It's an actual economic term. So you're fine, honey. I already fed him. Anyway, so these are economies that were really strong. Sometimes they're called the Asian tiger economies, but they're in Asia. They're specific, like tech-based exporting countries. So think Singapore, South Korea, even places like Thailand, definitely South Korea, Japan. But they're in Asia, India, that have economies that are newly industrialized because they started industrializing, or they went through their version of the Industrial Revolution with urbanization and a move to manufacturing jobs later in the 20th century, as opposed to the United States that did in the 1800s. And they're primarily in Asia. All right, maquiladoras. So maquiladoras are factories on the U.S.-Mexico border where a company like Ford, the automakers, did it first in the 70s. When they moved from the United States to seek cheaper inputs, cheaper labor, they... Greggy, don't get off there. Okay. When these manufacturing companies like Ford or General Motors, when they first moved, they didn't go to China because in the 70s, China wasn't even an open economy yet. Come here. And so they really moved to Mexico across the U.S. border. And it made sense because our highway system connected us to Mexico. We had a strong relationship with them. But they ended up being sweatshops, essentially, where the same job that paid, let's say, $35 an hour at a Ford plant in Flint, Michigan, moved across the border, just a little thin slice of land, went to Mexico, and then the people got paid $2 an hour. And then there was also the feminization of manufacturing jobs, where a job that was considered masculine and manly and a breadwinner job in the United States, when they moved to places like Mexico, they mainly hired female workers. Why do you think they did that? You can pay women less. So maquiladoras, it sounds Spanish, and it's a Spanish name for a foreign-owned company that goes across. Doesn't have to be American. A lot of them are, but there's other companies involved too. The Japanese companies, German, etc. But foreign-owned companies that go to Mexico for the cheap labor and less stringent, less strong environmental regulations. All right, examples of primary sector activities. You guys did great on this on the quiz, but let's just go over it one more time. You do things that come from the ground or from the sea. So think mining, farming, fishing. The negatives are, there's a lot. Anything can make them vulnerable. A drought, a bad tropical storm, a drop in commodities prices, like nobody wants to eat blah, blah, blah anymore. They're limited. Things like oil, fish in the sea, there's only so many of them. And they're labor intensive. It costs a lot to mine, but the people are not paid well. Or it costs a lot to do large scale farming, but how much is the price of a banana? So the people aren't making that much money. Even things that cost a lot to buy, like diamonds, or even like a really awesome bar of chocolate or a great cup of coffee, the workers aren't seeing that money. So you don't want a lot of your economy in primary sector jobs. And that's why we see a lot of underdeveloped or lesser developed countries. The majority of their economy comes from this primary sector. And that's part of the reason they're underdeveloped. Other parts are, the United States is benefiting from those low prices. So we don't really want to help them out. Okay. Secondary sector, that is manufacturing and construction. The people that were building the highways in the United States to connect cities to suburbs in the 1950s. And then the people that, worked at the Ford plant or the air conditioner plant, what have you. And tertiary. So tertiary means the third sector, services. And this one is a little trickier for students, but because it's just so broad, it can be anything. Service sectors or the tertiary sector can be brain surgeon, real estate developer, anything that provides services to the community. So think of if you think of Dunder Mifflin, if you watch The Office, service sector. The people that make the paper are secondary. The people that farm the trees, the lumberjacks or what have you, they're the primary, and then they are the salespeople. A lot of you all have jobs in the service sector. Currently, I'm teaching. I'm in the service sector. It can be, someone that works at a bus or in a restaurant, someone that works at Target, a hairdresser, which wish I could see my hairdresser. So anything that provides a service. Flint, Michigan before and after Fordism. Don't worry about that. We didn't get to it. There's a really great documentary, if you ever have the time or inclination, called Roger and Me. But I can't find it for free, so we didn't watch it. Industrial Revolution, we already went over this. So it happened in the United Kingdom, specifically England, 1700s, spread to the United States, Canada, Western Europe. It's important because it brought on the manufacturing age, which was the first kind of major stage of capitalism, of mass production, keeps the price low, mass consumption, keeps your markets full so you get the profits, which later led to Fordism in the United States. It led to urbanization, mass urbanization of people in those territories, and really just cemented capitalism as the norm in terms of economics for a lot of the world. It also, you don't really need to know this for your test, but it also really cemented the relationship between the developed countries and the lesser developed countries, because the developed countries, like England, like the United States, relied on cheap goods from underdeveloped countries. And it was in order to get, all these cheap things like timber, lumber, what have you, iron ore, fruits, vegetables, whatever you need, in order to keep those prices cheap so that American and British consumers could buy them, we had to buy them for cheap. So this led to colonialism and later imperialism. Fordism and its U.S. and international geography. U.S. was the manufacturer of the world. Most of it was in what was called the manufacturing belt. So think upper Midwest, like Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, New York. Missing anything? International geography. All you really need to know about the international geography is that we were the superpower at the time, and the other superpower, the Soviet Union, wasn't really playing into capitalism. So we were the factory of the world. We sold our products elsewhere, and within the United States, of course. Post-Fordism, aka globalization. It's U.S. and international geography. In the U.S., jobs moved to the American South, what's called the Sun Belt. So we have the Rust Belt, Sun Belt shift. As the jobs leave the manufacturing belt, it gets a new nickname, the Rust Belt. And then the jobs move to places like Florida, Texas, California. And we don't really think of Oregon and Washington as sunny, but they're still part of the Sun Belt because they had these new tech jobs that were kind of the ideal jobs of moving from post-Fordism into globalization. So the manufacturing belt up north, Midwest, Northeast, Sun Belt, Florida, Texas, California. All right. We're rounding third, gang. Deindustrialization. It occurred in the 1970s. It was this violent breakup between Fordism and globalization. So there was no seamless movement between the chapter of capitalism known as Fordism to globalization. In fact, it was really messy. Think of that slide that's from Seattle that when Boeing laid off people in 1971, and it said, will the last person leaving Seattle please turn out the lights? And Seattle wasn't even hit as bad as places like Detroit and Flint, Michigan that still haven't rebounded from deindustrialization. So deindustrialization. So the lack of industrialization, the move of industrial jobs from the United States to places like Mexico and later Asia. Okay, So 1970s, it occurred. Oh, why did it occur? It occurred because Americans we had this great standard of living that we valued so much that made us the strongest middle class on the planet for a while. But American workers were expensive, and we saturated our market. You only buy so many refrigerators in your life. You only buy so many cars in your life if you're not super wealthy. And then other countries, like in Western Europe and East Asia, that had been decimated by World War II, had bounced back by the 1970s, and they were competing with us. Okay. Outsourcing. There's a definition straight out of the lecture, and basically it's when one country subcontracts contracts out a job to be done by a different company in a different country. And why do they do that? Cheaper. All right, how American employment and manufacturing services have both changed since the 1970s. Manufacturing went down. Services went up. That's why the vast majority of Americans today work in services, like 66 to 75%. Right to work laws. That comes directly from the lecture. It's very political, so some people have, depending on who you talk to, very different definition. But there are jobs that make it more difficult to unionize in states. They're state by state. Missouri has 2 elections in a row rejected right to work laws. We're one of the only places kind of in this part of the country that don't have it. Some people argue that it's good because it lures more investment in big multinational companies when it comes to your state. If you're a right to work, it also has great advertising or great marketing. Right to work. Who doesn't want the right to work? But the negatives people say is that those companies are lured into these states because they don't want unions, because they don't want to pay their workers their fair share, or if they don't want workers to get the benefits that they like healthcare that they think they deserve. Okay. Changing views on globalization. In the 1990s, globalization, the critiques were mainly from ex-manufacturing workers, environmentalists, scholars, hippies. It was kind of like generally from Democratic to farther left. But all mainstream politicians, going from Ronald Reagan, George W., both dad and son, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, all the mainstream ones thought that globalization, having close ties with other countries would bring peace and prosperity, and it was the best thing for all of us. Then in 2016, we start to see Bernie Sanders, who's running for the Democratic nomination, and Donald Trump running for the Republican nomination, and they both, in mainstream politics, running for president of the United States, are critical of globalization, and we see new critiques of globalization. In particular, Bernie Sanders represented more of the further left side. So, it's okay. So he was more, globalization is bad because it hurts lesser developed countries because they are in an unfair power struggle with northern countries. They can't compete with us. They're kind of at our mercy. It's bad for the environment, and it's bad for American workers. With Donald Trump, you see the first big critique of globalization coming from business and coming from the Republican side of things. And their critique is that America gets a raw deal and that we need to put America first. So instead of trade deals, which Trump argues hurt America, we need to stick to ourselves. And we need to bring back these manufacturing jobs and make them work in America again. And then the other big critique of globalization is that all this international cultural exchange, including immigration, is hurting Americans, and we're not getting jobs because of immigrants. So build a wall is part of his critique. Basic history of the middle class in the United States. 3 phases. Okay, so this is from that video link, or that NPR Marketplace link. The first was farmers. The United States had a big, think of the founding fathers, they have all these people in the USA, and they want to keep them happy / don't overrule the government. Don't have another revolution. So how do you do that? You cultivate an educated middle class. And if they're educated, they'll be good voters, they'll be good citizens. And if they're middle class and not struggling they're going to be content and they're not going to want to overthrow things. So they had primary education, and then there's already a lot of farmers, so they looked around, what do we have a lot of? Farmers. We want a middle class, let's make farming more profitable, more stable. So they gave land ownership to people, and that the middle class 1.0, the yeoman farmer, farmers that own their own land, became the middle class. It wasn't organic, it was created by the government and people that were activists saying, like, come on, let's make life easier for people. But it was created. Then we start to see a loss of farming jobs because of the Industrial Revolution. But these jobs working in factories were not good. They were considered unskilled. They were paid terribly. Children were working. You were working all day long. You didn't have weekends off, and you were not paid well. So we see the loss of the middle class in terms of farmers that own their own land. And again, economists, scholars, politicians were like, well, what can we do? Okay, what do we have a lot of jobs of? Factory workers. Let's make factory work middle class work. So they activists fought for things like minimum wage, weekends off, unions fought for these things. And then we have Ford that gave you the $5 workday that dramatically improved the status of these jobs. And then 3.0, we don't know. Service jobs. Are they going to make us working poor of a giant class of Americans that are working paycheck to paycheck? Are we going to lose that chunk of the middle class to the paycheck to paycheck? Because you work at Target and you work at Quick Trip and you have to work 2 jobs. Or you're a teacher or a nurse and you're barely you have the education, but you're just not making a lot of money. Or are we going to have the middle class 3.0 be these service jobs, and how do we do that? Because not everyone can have a job in tech. Not everyone can have a job in the real estate development. So what do we do? And then that's the future of the middle class in America, essentially. Is it going to grow and be another chapter of, Americans' high standard of living? Or are we going to start seeing people that are struggling to get by, working 2 jobs without benefits, without protections, etc.? Okay, well, this is it. If you have any questions, please email me. If you need a summer class, sign up. And bye-bye.